A grieving father, unable to shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong, made a decision that would change everything. He placed a hidden camera inside his daughter's coffin. What he discovered? A truth so horrifying, it shook him to his core. When Jacob Harris lost his 17-year-old daughter, Alana, he was shattered. The doctors said it was a tragic accident, a sudden, unexplained death. But something inside him refused to believe it. The circumstances felt wrong, the explanations too vague. His instincts screamed that there was more to the story. So, before her burial, Jacob made a decision. He placed a hidden camera inside Alana's coffin. It was an act of desperation, of a father who needed answers. But what he found, it was beyond anything he could have imagined. Jacob Harris sat in the dimly lit funeral home, his hands clasped tightly together as he stared at the closed casket before him. His 17-year-old daughter, Alana, was gone, or at least, that was what they told him. The doctors claimed it was a sudden cardiac arrest. They said that sometimes these things just happen. No warning, no symptoms, just one moment she was there, and the next, she was gone. But Jacob could not accept that. Alana had always been healthy. She was a track runner, an honor student, full of life and energy. The idea that she had simply collapsed and died without any explanation did not sit right with him. At first, he tried to convince himself he was just grieving, that maybe he was looking for answers where there were none. But then, the strange things started happening. From the moment Alana's body was taken to the morgue, things felt off. The hospital staff was evasive, reluctant to answer his questions. When he requested an independent autopsy, the coroner refused, saying that her cause of death was already determined and there was no need for further investigation. Even the funeral home staff acted strangely. When he first arrived to see Alana's body, the funeral director avoided eye contact. The workers whispered to each other when they thought he wasn't looking. And then came the biggest red flag. Jacob had requested an open casket service. He wanted to see his daughter one last time, to say goodbye properly. But when he arrived at the funeral home that morning, the director hesitated. "Sir, we really do not recommend an open casket," he said, his voice tight. "It is best to remember her as she was." Jacob frowned. "But I specifically asked for an open casket." "I understand," the director said quickly, "but there were complications with the embalming process. It would not be a good idea." That was when Jacob felt it in his gut. He clenched his fists, trying to stay calm. "I still want to see my daughter." The director hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Of course, sir. Just give us a moment." Jacob watched as the funeral workers exchanged nervous glances before disappearing into the back. A few minutes later, the casket was opened, and Jacob stepped forward. His breath caught in his throat. It looked like Alana. The same long black hair. The same delicate features. But something was off. Her skin was too pale, too smooth, almost waxy. There were no visible signs of death. No bruising. No marks. She looked too perfect. Then he noticed something else: her hands. They were curled into fists. That was wrong. Alana had always been relaxed, even in sleep. The mortician should have posed her hands properly. But instead, they looked like she had been gripping onto something, like she had been trying to hold on. A chill ran down Jacob's spine. His instincts screamed at him. Something was terribly wrong. Jacob could not shake the unease twisting inside him. Every logical thought told him that this was just his grief clouding his mind. But deep down, he knew. He had learned to trust his instincts. So, before the final viewing, Jacob made a decision. When no one was looking, he carefully slipped a small, motion-activated camera inside Alana's casket, hidden between the fabric lining. It was a desperate move. A part of him felt guilty. What kind of father puts a camera in his own daughter's coffin? But another part of him whispered, "You will regret it if you don't." If nothing happened, fine. He could live with being paranoid. But if something did happen, then Jacob would be ready. He had no idea that in less than 24 hours, that camera would reveal a truth so horrifying. It would shake him to his core. Jacob Harris sat alone in his dimly lit living room, his fingers tapping anxiously on the wooden table. It had been less than 24 hours since Alana's burial, and yet his gut refused to settle. He had spent the entire day trying to convince himself that he was just a grieving father grasping at shadows. That maybe, just maybe, he had let paranoia get the best of him. But as he picked up the small memory card from the hidden camera he had placed in Alana's coffin, his heart pounded. What if he was right? He took a deep breath, inserted the memory card into his laptop, and hit play. At first, there was nothing. The screen was dark. The only sound was the muffled echo of the funeral service above ground, fading as the dirt was shoveled over the casket. Then, hours later, a sound. A faint, almost imperceptible creaking noise. Jacob's breath hitched. The screen remained dark, but the sounds grew louder, shuffling, rustling, as if something was moving inside the burial chamber. Then, out of the darkness, a shadow appeared. Jacob's entire body tensed. The lid of the coffin shifted slightly. Then, to his absolute horror, it began to open. Jacob's hand froze on the mouse. His heart hammered violently in his chest as he watched the casket lid being pried open from the outside. The dim glow from an unseen flashlight illuminated two shadowy figures. Their faces were obscured, but Jacob could see their gloved hands working quickly. His daughter's grave had just been dug up. Jacob's stomach turned. This was not grave robbing. Something else was happening. He leaned in closer, eyes glued to the screen. The first Manna funeral worker carefully lifted the lining of the coffin, while the second, a man wearing a surgical mask, pulled out a syringe. Jacob's entire body went cold. The man holding the syringe muttered something. Jacob rewound the footage and turned up the volume. His blood ran ice cold as he heard the words. She was not supposed to wake up. Jacob felt his throat tighten, his entire world shattering in an instant. Wake up? His mind reeled. His daughter had been declared dead. She had been buried. But these Menthe were acting like she had never died at all. The camera trembled slightly as the figures moved closer. One of them carefully pressed 2 fingers against Alana's wrist. Even through the grainy footage, Jacob could see the hesitation. The way the man froze for a split second, Jacob held his breath. Then the man shook his head and whispered something to his partner. "It's too late now." The second man let out a frustrated sigh. "We should have taken her sooner," he muttered. "If the hospital had done their job, we would not be dealing with this." Jacob's hands clenched into fists. The hospital. The very same hospital that had refused a second autopsy. The hospital that had rushed to sign the death certificate. The hospital that had lied. Jacob could barely breathe. They had buried his daughter alive. And now they were trying to cover it up. His hands shook with rage. His instincts had been right all along. And now, Jacob was going to make them pay. Jacob Harris could not think. His entire world had just been shattered by what he saw on that screen. His daughter, his beautiful, innocent Alana, had not been dead when they buried her. She had been alive. And now, these men were trying to cover their tracks. His breath came in sharp gasps as he replayed the footage, his mind racing. The 2 men in the video continued their horrifying task. The funeral worker pulled out a scalpel, carefully cutting along the lining of the coffin while the masked man injected something into Alana's arm. Jacob gritted his teeth. "What the hell are you doing?" he muttered under his breath. Then, the next words from the man in the mask made Jacob's blood boil. "We need to get her out of here before anyone starts asking questions." Jacob snapped. His instincts took over. He grabbed his car keys, his phone, and the camera, and bolted out the door. He did not even stop to put on his jacket. He needed to get to the cemetery, now. The streets blurred as he sped through town, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. His mind was on fire. Every image from the video replayed in his head. The coffin lid opening. The syringe. The whispered words. She was not supposed to wake up. Jacob slammed his foot down on the gas pedal. They were taking her. And he was going to stop them. Jacob screeched to a stop outside the cemetery, his tires kicking up gravel. He jumped out of the car and ran toward the burial site. The only thing that mattered now was getting to his daughter. The graveyard was eerily silent. The only sound was the distant rustling of leaves in the wind. Then he saw it. A dim light flickered in the distance. Jacob froze. He could see shadows moving. 2 figures crouched over Alana's freshly dug-up grave. His stomach churned with rage. They were still there. They were trying to take her body. Jacob did not hesitate. With every ounce of fury inside him, he charged. "Hey!" he bellowed, his voice slicing through the silence. The 2 men's heads snapped up in alarm. One of them, the funeral worker, stumbled backward, dropping his flashlight. The other, the man in the surgical mask, froze mid-motion. For a brief second, no one moved. Then, in a blur of panic, they ran. Jacob did not chase them. He had no interest in them anymore. His only focus was on the open coffin. He rushed forward, his heart pounding so violently that he could barely breathe. His hands trembled as he reached the grave, staring down into the casket. What he saw destroyed him. The coffin was empty. Alana's body was gone. Jacob felt the ground sway beneath him. His chest tightened as a sickening realization hit him like a freight train. They had already taken her. His hands curled into fists. He forced himself to stay upright, his vision blurring with rage. His daughter was not in that grave, which meant she could still be out there, which meant he was not done yet. As he turned back toward his car, his mind racing for answers, something caught his eye, a piece of paper sticking out from the coffin lining. With shaking hands, he reached for it and pulled it out. It was a hospital document. His eyes scanned the words, his pulse hammering. Then he found it the name of a medical facility. Jacob's entire body went cold. This was not just a stolen body. This was a cover-up, a conspiracy, a crime far worse than he had ever imagined. And now, Jacob was going to tear it all down. Jacob knew he had no time to waste. He immediately called the police and rushed to the cemetery. Authorities arrived within minutes, shovels in hand, digging up the fresh grave. When they opened the coffin, it was empty. Alana's body was gone. The police launched a full investigation, leading them back to the hospital. That is when the truth unraveled. Alana had been declared dead too soon. But before her family could request a second opinion, her body had been secretly claimed by a private medical institution. They had been harvesting organs. Alana had been alive when she was buried. And the men in the video? They were sent to retrieve something they had left behind. The funeral home was shut down, and several employees were arrested for their involvement in illegal body trade. The hospital was exposed for forging death certificates to cover up medical crimes. Jacob became an advocate for families who had lost loved ones under suspicious circumstances. This story is a reminder that evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears a white coat. Jacob trusted the system to take care of his daughter. But what he discovered? The system had buried the truth literally. Always ask questions. Always demand answers. Because sometimes, the people we trust the most are the ones who betray us in the worst ways. Subscribe for more powerful stories that expose hidden truths and shocking secrets.